educational, and it's funny. You might cry, but I don't want that to deter you from going if you're afraid of crying. But
good crying.
Yeah, good crying. Yeah, it's really great. It's very informal, and it's taken from a very intersectional and inclusive perspectives. And it's a really great show. And all of the proceeds from the show go to Verity, which is Sonoma County's only rape crisis center. So that's super duper awesome. It's only $5, so that's not a lot, which is great. Faculty is $10. But yeah, you can buy your tickets in the box office, like the Infodesc in the Student Center, or you can buy them online. But if you have any other questions, just ask me. But we're a really great cause. It's a really, really awesome performance and movement. So you guys should go.
I would say that it's one of the most moving things that I have ever experienced.
Yeah.
And the student production, entirely student run, student directed, student acted. It's absolutely amazing. And I know some of your mentors are kind of strong-arming you to go. So you will have an amazing experience.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, but the show is next weekend. And I know that Lip Jam is on the 25th, but you can definitely go to Sunday to go to 2 weeks.
So not this coming fall.
Yeah, the next weekend, yeah. The 24th, the 25th, and the 26th at 7:30.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Our speaker today, Dr. Amanda Morrison. She has a Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Austin in cultural anthropology, right? Yeah. She has been a faculty member in our Department of Latino Studies. Currently, what's the name of your office there?
Coordinator of Intercultural Center.
She coordinates the Intercultural Center at SRJC Petaluma campus, right? She does all kinds of interesting research in the areas of Chicano and Latino identities that play out, especially in popular culture. So we are moving today to really address very focused way the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. Okay, so this is our first lecture that sort of goes full on Oscar Wilde. Dr. Morrison has published articles about all kinds of pop culture depictions and resonances with the Latino Chicano communities. For instance, she's written published articles about music, hip-hop, so-called chick lit in the Mexican American context, all kinds of cool stuff like that. She's won a number of research fellowships and is very active as a public intellectual, having worked in public organizing and writing and editing for a number of popular press periodicals. Right?
Thank you.
All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Please welcome Amanda Morrison.
Yeah, this is, I think, the third or fourth year I've actually given this lecture with a few modifications every year, and I really enjoy it, so thanks for having me. How far are you in the book? Well, there's how far you are, and then there's how far you're supposed to be, and they might be the same or they might not, but where are we in the book? Early? Mid? Done? There's no consensus whatsoever. Yeah? Halfway-ish, okay. Yeah, so there's a lot going on in this book. I was just talking to a friend of mine, and she was like, yeah, I read it, and I really liked it, but I just kind of found it it had this entertainment value, and then I really rethought it. I didn't take it in a class, and there's all these depths of, these levels of depth. And a lot of, Junot Diaz, the author, he's become one of our foremost voices around race relations and racism. Or anti-racist work in the United States, so I would consider him one of our foremost public intellectuals currently. And so he's saying a lot of things, I would say, about race relations, racial identity, and ethnic identity, culture, and gender, especially masculinity. So I'm going to kind of go through some of those, as well as that pop culture element he has going on. You know all those footnotes? Those footnotes are kind of weird, right? Do you find them distracting or kind of fun? It's different, right? You see footnotes in the academic articles you read, and they're very scholarly, but he uses them in a really creative way to go deep into some pretty obscure, subcultural stuff, which is interesting. So the first thing I want to kind of talk about is, the issue of race in Oscar Wilde. How the characters are navigating their racial identity. I was just doing I've done a brainstorm. Well, here, just the references he uses and the language he uses is probably not so familiar to a lot of you. A lot of it is just East Coast centric, so it's not going to be that familiar to us as California, you know, with our little myopic West Coast like point of view, unless some of you might be from other parts of the country. Like you come across this word doyo, right? Doyo means Dominican, or that's short for Dominican York. It definitely has a hip hop kind of like patois to it. You also come across, did you notice the term he uses to describe like young Puerto Ricans in the New York area? He calls them Puerto Rocks or Puerto Rocks. That's kind of a hip hop reference because a lot of early hip hoppers were, a lot of the dancers especially, they would use terms like body rock, and they were predominantly Puerto Rican and African American. So it's the kind of use of language to, you know, language around identity, ethnic and national origin identity. But what we're talking about isn't, you know, some far-flung place somewhere down in the Caribbean or down in Latin America. We're talking about New York here. So this is the terrain, and I think so. A doyo, or Dominican York, I learned this from Junot Diaz too. I didn't know that slang either. It can kind of just think of the whole New York metro area, kind of like you think of the Bay Area metro area. It's a big area. And that's the world of the characters. Although it does flash over to the DR, to the island. But the world of the characters, it's really not so much Manhattan and the 5 boroughs that you think of with New York. It's the New York metro area which includes eastern Jersey, right? New Jersey. So they're up there in Paterson, which are these kind of working class suburbs in a pretty working class area of New Jersey, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, it's a New York metro milieu. Let's think about who, okay, so we're not talking, like in California, when you think of Latinos, I think a lot of people think of Mexican Americans, also referred to as Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx. That's the dominant national origin group of Latinos here in California, for sure, right? You know this, right? Don't make the mistake of calling every Latino Mexican, you know, people get pissed and all that, and I don't blame them, right? Because there's more people of Mexican origin in California than there are, say, people from Dominican Republic or even El Salvador or any of the other Latin American countries. We sort of dominate. It's a little bit obnoxious maybe to, you know, like culturally dominate out of sheer numbers. But in the East Coast, as probably you know, it's more people, there's more and more Mexicans migrating there, but it's more traditionally and historically, the Caribbean islands are the sending areas to the New York metro area. So one of those islands is land masses is the Dominican Republic. So can anyone think of any celebrities that you know are doyos or just Dominicano in origin? It's probably a hard question to answer because Latinos often, you don't get that specificity. I Googled it. Zoe Saldana, A-Rod, Jules Santana, he's not around that much. He was in the Dipset. I don't know if you even remember that. Michelle Rodriguez from Fast and Furious. And, okay, Sammy Sosa. I purposely chose this picture. Some years ago, he was doing some weird stuff with face bleaching. Do you remember hearing about that with Sammy Sosa? I would say that that's evidence of some Fuku. You know the word Fuku? Pay attention to the word Fuku. It's a theme in the novel. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. Fuku is a curse. It's a haunting. It's a specter. It's a pain. It might be some generational trauma. It might be some generational trauma around race and colonialism. Because there are issues here. We got issues. We all got issues. I would say the whole American hemisphere has issues around historical trauma, race, and colonialism. So they're manifesting in unique ways in all different, groups and nations. So we're kind of focusing on Dominicanos today. So there's obviously a preference in some people in their heart and soul, there's a denial or what's the word? A kind of refutation of blackness, unfortunately. So an internalized racism. I would interpret what Sammy Sosa was doing that way, but I don't know. People would have different takes. And then that's Junot Diaz himself, who's quite the public figure these days. And my question is, there's an interesting thing that comes up here around blackness. So there's a complicated identity going on here. or going on among a lot of folks who are Latino from the Caribbean, especially. Do you consider any of these celebrities black when you think of the ones you were familiar with? Do you think, oh, okay, that's an African-American actor, celebrity? Any of these? Or you're all like, I don't ever think about race, I am colorblind. I'm gonna push you beyond that. Do you think of any of these celebrities as black? Like Jules Santana, to me, the way he appears, the fact that he's a rapper, my immediate kind of assumption would be, yeah, that's an African-American MC. And that's not necessarily wrong. That's the thing. Yeah?
But do we only think of him as black because he has like the bandana and we know that he raps? Like, is that
Right.
the reason why we think of him as black? Like Sammy Sosa, we're not like, oh no, he's not black because like he's a baseball player. Like is that why we're not making that connection?
I don't, yeah, I know, and I might be projecting stereotypes that you're calling out, right? Like my visual cues are like, oh, that I equate that with blackness. It might not be that simple. Or that might be a partial truth or part of the way he identifies. I don't know, right? Zoe Saldana, I kind of think of her as a black actress, but the kinda is interesting there, you know what I mean? There's something a little ambivalent or ambiguous there. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say about her specifically. I was going to say that it might be the same issue as with Jules Santana, but she just played Nina Simone in a movie.
Right.
It's kind of like layers of complicated, right?
Yes.
She got so much flack for the way that
She did.
played that role, but obviously, I think by taking that role, she's saying that she feels black, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right. So a lot of it is, I mean, like I think the one thing around like anti-racist work is to respect the way individuals construct their identities, right? And you know, there's the stereotypes and perceptions, and there's the way people self-assert themselves in their experiences and their experience of their body, even, right? So yeah, but a lot of people went because she played Nina Simone, who was a really famous, iconic like jazz and soul singer from like the '60s era, and Nina Simone was quite dark-skinned, and doesn't look anything like Zoe Saldana. Not like there's no resemblance. So people felt like, why did you cast it that way? Zoe Saldana fits more of the kind of, you know, Anglo-normative, lighter skin, more mulata, more like a certain kinds of features that don't historically get as associated with quote-unquote blackness. So yeah, these racial politics and these stuff, they come up in our pop culture discourse a lot because there's still a lot of tension and, you know, issues and wounding there. So there's this kind of ambivalence. You know, Michelle Rodriguez, when I look at her, and I think of her, and you know, I know how she speaks, and I've seen her in roles, and I like her. She's a good actress. She fits in the Hollywood and the show business framework, the way they do casting. She fits in the more like the Latina look. When there's casting calls and they call for a Latina character, typically they're looking for someone who looks more like Michelle Rodriguez. If you look more like you are Afro-Latino or something like that, you're going to actually experience discrimination hugely because casting directors are typically not, no, that's not Latina, that's black. They're not the same thing. Well, there might be some overlap there, right? So this came up not in the celebrity world in Hollywood, but recently in the world of politics. So that's the other thing to consider, is Oscar black? Or how is Oscar navigating his blackness? This is interesting. This just came up. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Congressional Black Caucus. So that's a group of senators and US representatives who caucus together around issues around black identity and racism and stuff like that. It's been around since the Civil Rights era, I think. So there's this newly elected congressman, Adriano Espaillat. He was just elected. He represents the same area that the book is set. And they are not sure if they want to let him in because he's identifying as African American, and he's Dominicano, and certainly has Afro-Latino heritage, but the Hispanic Black, the Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, is not sure if he's black or not. It's a confusing thing, and I do think that's pretty harsh because he's asserting a black identity, but they're wondering what his motives are. Is this just to get into some sort of, you know, corridors of power? Is this a political move? Do you really identify with the black experience? They're all he's being second guessed, but he has a different and maybe to some extent not stereotypical black identity. He is Afro-Latino of Dominican heritage. And that's the identity that's the world we're in, right? For the most part. So these things just keep coming up. We'll skip that. I don't think I have enough time. But if you, what's that? Oh, yes.
Particularly ironic about that is that Charlie Rangel, who's one of the prominent elders or seniors of the Congressional Black
He is, yeah.
has Puerto Rican ancestry.
Yeah.
But he reads African American black in a way that Escalade does not readily.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like even that, right? So like,
Right.
they're together.
Uh-huh.
They have some of the same sort of Afro-Caribbean.
Right. And Charlie Rangel, he's been in, I mean, he's a more known entity. He's been around so long in Congress. And it's like he's perceived as black, but it's actually the same kind of track of identity, right? Yeah, so these things are just, they're ambiguous, right? They are ambiguous because actually race has always, those categories have never been scientifically valid. They've always been social constructs with real effects, but they're social constructs, so you're not going to be able to hold someone to a blood quantum or this shade on a spectrum of darkness and have a scientific formula for race. It's a sociocultural and historical construct, but with real effects. I would say anyone in the whole world who lives anywhere but Africa, but has African descent, you can use this term diaspora. It's really helpful. Raise your hand if you've ever heard the term diaspora. Okay, this is a good one. Does anyone know what diaspora means? Diaspora. It first was associated with Jewish people, historically. Diaspora, the root word is same as spore, so seeds that are spreading. Okay, so in terms of humanity, it's a grouping, it's like an ethnic or cultural grouping that for whatever reasons, usually harsh reasons like dislocation, colonialism, violence, have had to leave their homeland and spread out, evacuate, migrate under often difficult circumstances. So we would say there's an African diaspora, okay? So the only black, it's not like there's only Africans and then black folks in America. There are African descended people all over the world, largely as a result of not entirely, but as a result of European colonialism. So obviously in our deep south, but sabes que, the Caribbean was the main spot in the Americas for the slave trade. I'm not letting the US off the hook, I'm just saying the Caribbean with all that sugar plantation and all that commerce, making the rum and the triangular trade and all that, the Caribbean, just massive boatloads of human beings were brought from Africa and exploited. And so, in the Caribbean, throughout Latin America, but especially in the Caribbean as well as Brazil, you have lots and lots of the population who has African heritage. And to greater and lesser extents, depending on the individual, identifies as black, or maybe doesn't. So that's kind of a personal and political thing. Did you guys watch this, the Skip Gates piece on on Dominican Republic and Haiti? Yeah? Can you give me a nod, if so? So that's the island that the two nation states share, right? So it's Hispaniola, the island we think of with Christopher Columbus rolling up on it, right? And starting the whole litany of colonialism. They share a border. One is Franco, what's the word? French speaking, one is Spanish speaking. They have their own border tensions, kind of like we have with the US, in the US and Mexico, definitely, like deportations and everything, accusations of racism and xenophobia. Does anyone remember in the video you watched, Skip Gates, the host, he's walking down the street with a Dominicano scholar, a man, middle-aged or so, and they see in the window, the store window, like a figurine of like a problematic figure, right? Do you remember that scene? And do you remember what the Dominicano scholar says about like how we identify, so it was basically one of those mammy type figurines, right? Those really racist kind of like really dark-skinned lady with red lips. It's a clay figurine or something like that, right? And the Dominicano scholar is giving him insight in how they think of blackness a lot in the Dominican Republic. Do people call them, he said by and large, do people identify as black? Do you remember the answer? When Skip Gates said, do people identify as black here? What did he say? No. By and large, no. Do you remember what he said? Spanish? There was another interesting, that one that really threw me off. Spanish or, yeah.
They consider themselves like Indio? Indian, native. Which is part of the truth, certainly, Taino Indians. But there's a denial of, you don't want to claim negro. You don't want to claim blackness. So there's a through line, a mainstream aversion to claiming blackness in Dominican Republic. Not that everyone is like that, but there's some Fuku there. There's definitely some Fuku there. There's some mess there. And you think about it, they share a border and an island with the one nation in the entire world that is a black-led nation. For all its chaos and craziness, it's the one nation that was founded by a successful African slave rebellion. Haiti was founded, they shirked off their French colonial masters, slaves, a whole uprising. This is in the, around the time of our founding fathers, a slave uprising, and they did it. They founded a nation based on the black identity of Haiti, because there's so many people descended from slaves in Haiti, and they successfully did it. But they were punished for generations and generations by the French. Huge taxation and all kinds of interference in their government. Then the US during the Papa Doc era. Everyone's been messing with Haiti. Haiti's kind of a mess, right? Politically, but culturally that's amazing. It's identified as a black nation, founded as a black nation. Not that you have to be black to live there, but that's all the foundational figures are African. And then Dominican Republic next door has this Fuku around blackness, right? So there's tension there. In order to understand, I think, how a lot of Latinos, either Latin Americans or even Latinos here in the US, think about race, we have to understand that they're really different paradigms. So I would say, and a lot of others have spoke to this, in the United States, we've historically thought of race in terms of a binary. A binary is what? What's a binary? What does the word binary mean? In computers? 1 and 0, yes and no, good and bad, black and white, male and female, gay or straight, either or. That's a binary. Now, your generation is doing some good work around disrupting overly simplified binaries around identity issues, right? And one thing that comes up when it's, in terms of gender, in terms of, because there's a spectrum, there's trans people are having a bigger voice now. In terms of gay or straight, it's not always that clear, right? And it never has been. And then it comes up around race for us too, because most of our discussions, maybe until recently, when we talk about race and racism in the United States, we're talking about black and white issues, right? But then where do Latinos and Asians fit in there? So there's historical experiences of racism for Latinos and Asian Americans as well. But that kind of falls through. In fact, Latino and Asian is not even, Latino is not considered a race on the US Census. And there's a good argument for that. It's complicated, but because you can be black or you can be white and be Latino. It's very complicated. But just talking about black and white in the United States doesn't quite capture what's going on when, up in Healdsburg and Windsor, there are, to my mind, there are immigration sweeps that are terrorizing our Latino community here, because a big part of our Latino community here is either immigrants or children of immigrants here in Sonoma County, and there's a lot of terror going on right now because there's an escalation of that sort of, deportation force that a lot of us have been really worried about. And a lot of people experience that as a kind of racialized identity and racial terror, arguably, but these are experiences. Okay, so Latin America, history of race is different. It's not that like Latin American nations are so racially progressive or, don't have racism or don't think about race. They do, they just have more categories. So that's a Casta chart from the colonial era when the Spanish ruled. Literally, if there were couplings across, there were just more categories. So the Spanish church authorities just wanted to keep track because they really wanted to maintain the hierarchy of Spaniards, light-skinned Spaniards being at the top of the racial hierarchy. They had the power, they held the government power, they had the wealth, right? and you go all the way down, and there's a list of so many, it's like coyote, mulatto, zambo, like all these different categories that we don't have in the United States. And so you see these in Oscar Wow. You'll see these. There's just a million different, some of them are kind of slang. Honestly, I don't know what they all mean, because I'm an American, I'm US oriented, I don't know what they all mean. Some of them come from the Dominican Republic, some of them circulate throughout Latin America. It's just a proliferation of categories. So that makes it kind of more confusing to understand racial dynamics when there's like whole different paradigms between the US and most of the rest of Latin America, where it's binary versus multiple categories, yet still with a racial hierarchy where European and light skin is at the top of the hierarchy. Cocolo, I don't know what that means. So you know, Cocolo, Trigueña, I don't remember. We'd have to Google it, but it comes up in Oscar. I pulled these all from Oscar Wilde. So I just wanted to say, but there are always, you know, Latinos and like Chinese Americans, other Asian Americans, were always racialized in the United States. There's ample evidence of that. So Mexicans were discriminated against in the Jim Crow era, much the same way as African Americans were. But that story kind of drops out because we usually just talk about the stories of black and white, which are obviously important. But then there's more to it too. Okay, so I want to introduce this term mestizaje. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It just comes from the Spanish root mezclar, which means to mix. So I would say, and that's kind of what's being pointed to at this casta chart. So there was a lot of intermarriage in the Latin American colonial era. And it's not that there was no concerns around that. It's just that it was more the norm for people to cross racial lines. But also I have to say, in all of the Americas, a lot of the mixed race people that have emerged that have either Native American, European, or African American, or a mix of all three, a lot of that emerged out of sexual violence and systematic rape too. So a lot of our ancestors, if you look back at your ancestry, and there was some kind of racial crossing, and some of it might have been consensual, but some of it deep down might have been some really terrifying violence, right? And we're the children of that. So Latinos are the children of a mass rape. African Americans most of us, not all, but most, have that in our past. It's Fuku. It's Fuku. It's generational trauma. That's just there. It's just a fact. It was that widespread. So I'll skip through that. So we're just talking about a kind of very mixed environment, mezclar. So mestizaje means to mix. In Latin America, that's how they talk about race a lot. We're mixed people. In the United States, we don't talk about being mixed that much. A lot of us are. A lot of us identify as like biracial or something like that, right? Raise your hand if you identify as like kind of a mixed ethnic or racial heritage. That's a lot. That's about at least a quarter of you. Yeah, because we have less restrictions on crossing the color line in our romantic relationships, right? So a lot of us are coming from mixed backgrounds. I am too. My dad's white, my mom's Mexican American. But we don't have as much language for that. In Latin America, they have more language for that. So it's mestizaje, from the root mezclar, which means to mix. So also, I want to talk about another mix. That's the cultural mix in New York that most of us as Californians don't know much about. We're talking about the 5 boroughs plus parts of New Jersey. We're talking about certain neighborhoods where there's a lot of vibrant street culture. That's where a lot of the language and the references come from. We're talking about the Bronx. We're talking about Harlem. We're talking about Washington Heights. Yeah, like In the Heights. You know the guy who made the Hamilton, the theater piece Hamilton? His first play, which is also a cool musical, is called In the Heights. It's set in Washington Heights, which is near Harlem. Lots of amazing musical and street cultural traditions coming out of this mix. That's Junior's mix. That's Lola's mix. That's Oscar's mix, although he's a bigger misfit because he doesn't identify with the kind of gritty street culture that you think of when you think of hip hop, or you think of like, you know, Black Panthers and Young Lords and kind of edgy, like revolutionary street culture. You think of like the Fania, the salsa guys from the 1970s, guys and girls, you know, when salsa, New York salsa emerged. This is all happening at the same time.
So it's a really interesting mix. Today we have, I'll end with this, but today we have a resurgence actually of Dominicano pop culture in our, we can talk about that. Maybe some of you heard of like Romeo Santos and stuff. Hip hop emerged in these neighborhoods, salsa emerged in these neighborhoods. Several generations ago, jazz emerged in these neighborhoods. It's a rich cultural tradition that these characters are living in. It's a mix. Yeah, so this is a little bit of a shift to gender. So I think that's the other big focus here. What Junot Diaz is doing around unsettling us around racial identity and the categories we take for granted. But also, he's doing some commentary around gender, particularly masculinity. Okay? So you got to ask yourself, Oscar is such an unusual character. Think about him as just an unusual character. So is he white or black? You got to ask yourself that. Or is it something more ambiguous, or is he disassociated with one or the other, or what's going on there? Because certainly I think Junot, right, his friend who's always trying to get his sister, right, Junot, Junot represents more this identity, whoops, more this kind of street, young, like, you know, Afro-Latino hip-hop generation guy, right? The hip, kind of, handsome, gets the ladies, heteronormative Latino guy, or Afro-Latino guy. Oscar, he's out there for his community. He does not fit into his community at all. What Junot, so they room in college, you might not get there, and then you're not there in the novel yet. Junot is always trying to get Oscar to be more like, just sort of be more manly to his mind. He's always, like people are always cutting Oscar down, like he's not a full man. He's not masculine, right? Why would that be? Why would his masculinity be in question? What have you come across around that? Are people clowning on him? Are they saying anything about him? Or what is it about his interests that are like, yo, what is that, right? Anything coming up yet? Yeah? He's a nerd, okay. I mean, nerds are having a resurgence. Nerd culture is kind of big right now, right? But yeah, he's a nerd. And what about his sexuality too? Does he get made fun of? His weight. So he's overweight, he's chubby. What else? Is he sexually experienced? I mean, he's a teenager. It starts with him as a teenager, but he goes through college. So he's a virgin. He's a virgin through most of the novel. Sorry, a little bit of spoiler. Whatever, he has sex eventually, okay? You gotta wait a long time, though. And then when it happens, it's really trippy. Yeah, he doesn't conform to the norms of masculinity, much less hyper-masculinity, the sort of street masculinity that you kind of associate with like hip-hop culture and street culture and stuff like that, that a lot of, especially African Americans and Latinos who grow up in lower income, working class neighborhoods feel compelled to conform to. He's so not fitting that mold, right? There's also the other, aside from being kind of tough and be able to hold your own and know the code of the streets and all of that, there's also this, the Latin lover. Have you ever heard of that stereotype? Are you familiar with the Latin lover stereotype? I mean, it's one of those weird stereotypes that is kind of positive, but I mean, theoretically, no one wants to be boxed in by any stereotype. But I guess for like Latino guys, if they're like thought of as like, oh, you're gonna be a good lover because you're Latino, they're like, yeah, okay. I don't know. I mean, but it's a stereotype, right? The stereotype of tall, dark, handsome Latino male, heteronormative, right? Straight male, who's a good lover, who can get a lot of women. So these are some of my, is there anyone in pop culture right now that you think of as like the Latin lover? I mean, Antonio Banderas for a long time, Enrique Iglesias, there's some, huh? Anyone else come up? You don't even know who some of these people are. Some of you, if you're like Mexican American, you might recognize the Fernandezes, Chente and Alejandro the Sun. They sing mariachi music and ranchera music, and it's all about wooing women, right? Ricky Martin. That's why it was such a big deal when he came out as gay, because the entertainment industries were priming him as a heteronormative, straight Latin lover. That's how they were selling him, right? And so there was so much stake, unfortunately, in a homophobic society. There was so much at stake commercially for him staying in the closet. So it was actually quite brave that he came out. And his career, honestly, was it ever the same? I don't think so. It is its own thing, but it doesn't fit that heteronormative role anymore. So who's heard of Romeo Santos? Only a few of you. God, Sonoma State. Sorry. How about Prince Royce? There's some passion coming up. I'm looking for white people who have heard of this. It's weird. There's crossover issues here. So, does anyone want to say a little bit about Romeo Santos or Prince Royce? Yeah? Okay, all right. What kind of music, what's the vibe of his music? Lovey-dovey. Yeah, it's very romantic, right? Huh? Any other feelings about these artists? They're still fairly popular, right, for those who know them? They've been around for a few years now, but there was this big trend in the last 5 years or so, maybe a little longer. Bachata music. It has a certain sound. I could play a video, but I think, go Google it. It has a pretty guitar sound, and it's very romantic and quite sexy. So I would say, hey, they're kind of winking at you as the Latin lover in the current music world, right? And they have sold a lot of records, mostly to U.S. or Latino audiences, so throughout the Americas, including U.S. Latinos. And it's interesting because I don't find that there's much crossover. When I ask Anglo folks whether they've heard of any of these kind of neo-bachata artists, I mostly know. And yet these are artists, so this just tells you that even our culture is kind of segregated, right? And they're marketed, kind of in a segregated way. Because, these are artists, I think one of them showed up at a Walmart, I don't know, meet and greet or something at a big store in LA or somewhere in Arizona. And literally it was mob, millions of people came out. Just, they're big, but it was all young Latino women mostly, or not totally all women, but a lot, right? So they're pop stars, but pop stars mostly within the Latin music sphere, but they are huge, and I think that they are marketable because the entertainment industry sees them as an extension of long-standing stereotypes around Latino masculinity, of this kind of Mr. Lova thing, right? And so when Junior to some extent embodies that, right? Does Junior is he sexually conservative? Is he a one girl or one guy man? You know who I'm talking about? Yeah. Okay. What's that? So Junior is actually, for a lot of it, he's actually the narrator. And if you haven't figured that out yet, then you're just not at the point where that becomes very clear. But he's also Oscar's close friend, but they're very different. He wants to get with Oscar's sister. And he wants to mold Oscar at a certain point in the novel into more of a Latin lover type. And Oscar's even if he wants to, he's it just is not happening, right? He's out of this box, which is powerful. He is out of that box. I think it's powerful when people don't fall into the expectations of who they should be. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about, let's kind of end this a little bit about what is Oscar into. So you talked about nerd. What is this nerd culture? What does that entail? What kinds of forms, what kinds of texts, what kinds of artifacts is in nerd culture? Yeah, in the middle here, any of you? Sci-fi, novels, sci-fi novels, sci-fi, maybe movies and TV too. So you get a lot of references. What else? Yeah. He writes a lot. He wants to be a writer. In what genre? Maybe some poetry. Okay. Anyone else? I think he's, maybe not, yeah, maybe it is short form poetry, but he eventually is working into the sci-fi fantasy genre, or what some people call speculative fiction. Okay, what else is you associate with nerd culture? Sci-fi, fantasy, movies, and books. What else? I'm not saying it's bad. This stuff is pretty entertaining, right? Yeah? Video games, so gaming, yeah. And I'm not saying anyone who does this is like, you know, pejoratively a nerd, okay? Or maybe we're all nerds. I'm a nerd, just not in the same way. Anime. Okay, yeah. I would say also comic books and graphic novels. Yeah, right? That's what he's into. Now, is that something that fits the mold of a young, streetwise, and attractive Latino? No. In fact, when you think of all this kind of quote-unquote nerd culture, which is kind of having a high moment now, because you have one of the biggest conventions in the United States and in the world, ComicCon, that came out of this kind of quote-unquote nerd culture, right? But it's one of the hottest tickets in town to go to Con. Has anyone ever been to ComicCon? You don't want to out yourself? Like, it's fun, right? It's a big deal. It's sick. What's sick about it? What's a memory you have? What'd you... Huh?
I'm into like science fiction stuff too, but it's like a big nerd cake.
But you celebrate that nerdiness, huh?
Exactly.
You claim it, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal now, and it's being reflected even in our mainstream pop culture with those TV series like The Big Bang Theory. I happen to love The Big Bang Theory, as do like so many other people. Remember this movie? I mean, the one thing in terms of what the associations with kind of nerd subculture, I think this may be changing because it is more like mainstream, and it's not like pejorative anymore. It's not as marginalized anymore, and there's not as much judgment being put on it. But for some time, I think it was associated more with like whiteness. Would you say the demographics at Comic-Con were fairly diverse or more predominantly white? Pretty diverse. Yeah, so you know that's changing. I think the association, the stereotype was more whites and Asian Americans, and not so many African Americans and Latinos. But I think that's changing because it's becoming a bigger deal, right? But you know, the stereotype of like maybe a generation ago was like, yeah, 40-year-old virgin. You know, like people who were not quote unquote cool, right? We could disagree, you know, like I don't agree with that, but that was a negative, you know, baggage. And I think Oscar, he's growing up in the late 80s, early 90s when this kind of culture was not seen as cool yet. You feel me? It was not seen as cool yet. It is more so now, but back then it was not. You wanted to be knowing about like Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul and like whatever was going on in, you know, like hip and urban. Nerd culture for a young Latino in the city, not so much. So he's out the box that way. And then this is another thing I think is cool to consider as you're reading. Junot Diaz, he's a clever guy. He is using science fiction and fantasy tropes or themes to help us understand Fuku, or the curse, or the intergenerational trauma and legacy of colonialism and racism that came out of the colonialism, right? These big European empires conquered the Americas, conquered much of the global south hundreds of years ago, beginning about 500 years ago. And there was a massive violence associated with that, genocidal violence and oppression. And racism comes out of that as a justification. And that is a dramatic, tragic story that we carry in our bodies. As descendants, many of us, I would say probably the majority of us has some kind of ancestor who was victimized in some way by this tragic history. Probably a woman who was, like I said, systematically raped. This happened on our US plantations, black women being raped by white overseers and plantation owners, widespread throughout, also with Native American women. Many of us, and even if it's not literally in your DNA and your ancestors, it's like baggage we carry. We carry that trauma even if you're not aware of it. You might have no idea, but it's there. It's there. We haven't been talking about it. We might be talking about the generational trauma of racism more now because it's coming up for us. Yeah. So that incredibly dramatic, tragic, just almost too crazy to believe story of empire, conquest, colonialism, he maps onto the tropes of science fiction. So think about it. Think about it.
Think about these themes. Evil overlords and demons. So think about like, Lord of the Rings and kind of those kinds of genre fiction. Evil overlords. Mordor, what's his name? The big eye in Lord of the Rings, right? Evil entities. The ciguapas, that's a very Dominican thing. I wasn't familiar with it, but the enchantresses. Think of like Odysseus in Greek myth, right? Goddesses. Curses. I curse you, right? Very fantasy sci-fi. It's the phantasms, the ghosts of our trauma. I would say it's a phantasmagoria, a setting of spectral or haunted, historical memory. So look at these. So hey, here's an evil overlord. Rafael Trujillo. Did you come across him? What is Trujillo? What is one thing you remember about Trujillo? So he's the dictator who dominated the Dominican Republic for quite some time. Anyone remember anything about him? I think it's towards the beginning where they flash back. So he really did this. He was so evil that whenever he, yeah, there's definitely like he had Fuku around race. Like in the Skip Gates documentary, it told that he was trying to whiten his skin to be lighter. Like he believed whiteness was better. So that obviously came through in terms of his policing and his policies and his oppressive, edicts. The other thing around gender and sexuality, so he would essentially rape any girl that he wanted access to as the presidente of the DR. So if he knew of some, office holder in his elite world, and he thought that his daughter was pretty, he would demand that that daughter was literally given to him for his sexual plaything. And if you didn't, what happened? You're killed. This is a real person. So truth is not, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes truth is stranger than science fiction, or more awful, right? And so, there are, the colonial moment. We're talking about conquistadores, like slaughtering Indians, and vice versa. Horrible, gory wars, right? And that, it kind of looks like fantasy, but it's not. I mean, these are renderings. These are old colonial renderings, but there is historical record of, babies being strung up and, burnt at the stake. And just insane violence that is part of our heritage in the Americas. 500 years of phantasmagoria gore, right? And cruelty. So you also come across terms like apocalypse, the fall, these big, epic kinds of fantasy narrative tropes. Well, maybe there was something apocalyptic that happened with this conquest, right? And the new world, the tropes of the new world. Well, you hear that in science fiction, don't you? We're going to take a rocket ship to the new world, right? Well, the Americas were also referred to as the new world. A world to explore, conquer, settle, right? Outer colonies. So that's a clever thing he does. I would just keep that in mind as you keep reading the way that he's mapping on science fiction fantasy tropes to this historical memory and trauma of racism and colonialism. So I'm out of time. I want to talk about uses of the N-word in the novel. So if you want to chat about, if you're weirded out by how he uses N-I-G-G-E-R, and you want to chat about that, come talk to me, because it was a trip to me too. Okay, thank you.